My parents worshipped my sister until they found out I'm a secret millionaire and demanded I hand over my fortune, and then I used to think my childhood was normal, at least for the first few years, when my parents still acted like I existed and gave me the same kind of attention any kid might expect from their family. They weren't exactly warm, never the type to shower me with praise or affection, but they were there when I needed them, and for a while, I thought that was enough. My dad took me fishing a few times at a little lake about an hour away, teaching me how to hold a fishing rod and sit patiently even when nothing was biting, while my mom helped me with my math homework at the kitchen table, pointing out my mistakes but never really getting frustrated with me. That was before everything changed overnight. The moment my younger sister came into the world too early and too fragile, turning my entire life into something unrecognizable. One minute, I was a regular 8-year-old girl with parents who at least pretended to care about me, and the next, I was just a background character in my own house, barely acknowledged unless I did something wrong or needed to be reminded that I wasn't the priority anymore. My Aunt Valerie showed up in the middle of the night, shaking me awake and telling me to pack a bag because my mom was in the hospital, her voice careful but urgent, like she was trying to keep me calm while making sure I understood that something serious was happening. Lillian wasn't supposed to be born yet, arriving 2 months ahead of schedule in a rush of panic and hushed voices, forcing my dad to leave me with my aunt while my mom spent weeks in the hospital, hovering over an incubator and praying my sister would make it. I remember the first time I saw her, so tiny she didn't even look real, covered in wires and tubes that beeped softly in the dim hospital light while my mom sat beside her, never once looking up when I walked into the room. That was the moment everything shifted, the exact point in time when I stopped being a daughter and became something closer to a guest in my own home, an afterthought in the presence of my sister's fragile existence. When they finally brought Lillian home, everything in our house changed so drastically that it felt like we had moved into an entirely different world, one ruled by an invisible list of new rules designed to protect her at all costs. My mother became obsessed with cleanliness, scrubbing every surface with industrial-strength disinfectant until the entire house smelled like a hospital, placing hand sanitizer bottles in every room and scolding me if I so much as touched a doorknob without washing my hands first. If I showed even the slightest sign of being sick, a sneeze, a cough, anything that might suggest I was carrying germs, I was immediately sent away to my Aunt Valerie's house or dropped off at my grandmother's without so much as an explanation. At first, I actually thought it was kind of fun, getting to spend extra time with my grandmother, who always had warm cookies waiting for me and let me curl up beside her while she read her favorite mystery novels aloud. My aunt had an entire bookshelf full of old Nancy Drew books, and I made it my mission to read every single one, enjoying the quiet sense of stability I found in her house, where nobody was hovering over a fragile newborn or treating me like I was radioactive. But kids aren't stupid, not even the ones adults think are too young to notice when something isn't right, and after a while, I started to understand exactly what was happening. I wasn't being sent away for fun little adventures at my relatives' houses, and I wasn't being temporarily relocated because of some temporary medical emergency with my sister. I was being erased, pushed out of my own home whenever my existence became inconvenient for my parents. I could feel the distance growing between us with every passing day, an invisible wall that only seemed to get thicker no matter how hard I tried to push through it. At first, I fought against it, doing everything I could think of to earn back their attention, trying to prove that I was still here and still worth noticing. I got straight A's on every report card, hoping my mom would look up from Lillian's latest doctor's appointment schedule long enough to say she was proud of me, but all I got was a distracted nod and a murmured, "That's nice, honey," before she went right back to whatever medical chart she was reviewing. I won first place in the school science fair with a project about renewable energy, thinking maybe this time my dad would care enough to ask me about it. But all he did was ask if I could keep my display board in the garage, because Lillian might be sensitive to the dust from the cardboard. The real breaking point came when I spent months teaching myself how to play bridge over troubled water on the piano for the school talent show, practicing every single day until I could play it perfectly from memory. The night of the performance, I stood on stage and scanned the audience, searching for even one familiar face in the sea of parents and siblings cheering for their kids, but my family wasn't there. Lillian had a mild fever, nothing serious, just a slightly raised temperature, but it was enough for them to decide that attending my event wasn't worth the risk. 2 weeks later, my sister played hot cross buns on a plastic flute for her school's beginner music recital, squeaking out each note in an off-key mess of sound. And my entire family showed up in full force, filling the front row and clapping like she had just performed at Carnegie Hall. That was the moment I realized something important, something that would stay with me for years, shaping every decision I made from that point forward. Nothing I ever did would be enough to make them see me, and nothing she ever did would be enough to make them stop. By the time I hit my teenage years, I had completely given up on the idea that anything I accomplished would ever mean something to my parents. And instead of chasing their approval, I started pouring all of my energy into making sure I had a way out. If they weren't going to acknowledge my existence beyond the occasional, "Can you grab that for Lillian?" or "Be quiet, your sister needs to focus," then I was going to make sure I built a life where their opinions wouldn't matter. I became obsessed with planning, organizing every part of my life with the kind of precision that made my classmates roll their eyes and call me a perfectionist, but I didn't care. Every night, I sat at my desk in my tiny, neglected bedroom, meticulously laying out schedules that covered everything from my study plans to my long-term goals, making sure that every decision I made was a step toward getting away from them as soon as humanly possible. My notebooks were filled with color-coded study guides and lists of potential college scholarships, each one carefully ranked by competitiveness, and my calendar was packed with every extracurricular activity that wouldn't interfere with my job at the local diner. While Lillian spent her afternoons whining about how exhausted she was from sitting on the bench during cheerleading practice, I was balancing school, work, and enough extracurriculars to make sure my college applications were undeniable. My parents barely noticed when I came home late from work or when I disappeared for entire weekends to participate in debate tournaments. But they never failed to show up for anything Lillian did, even when her accomplishments were meaningless. It didn't matter that she wasn't actually good at anything. What mattered was that she was trying, that she was special, that she deserved all the support and encouragement they had never once considered giving to me. I remember sitting alone in my room, scrolling through photos on my phone of my teammates celebrating after we won our second consecutive state championship, knowing that my parents had never attended a single one of my debates. They had no idea that I had become one of the most successful competitors in the state, that my ability to tear apart an opponent's argument with perfect composure had made me a rising star in the debate circuit, or that my talent for negotiation would eventually become the foundation of my career. The only time my father even acknowledged my participation was when I asked if they could come to a regional competition, and he laughed before saying, "Debating? You mean arguing for fun? Sounds like a waste of time." Meanwhile, when Lillian made the C team for cheerleading, a squad so irrelevant that they weren't even required to perform at games, my parents took her out for a celebratory dinner at her favorite steakhouse. It was the same pattern over and over again, and no matter how many times it happened, I could never quite shake the sting of it, that deep, cutting reminder that in their eyes, I would never be as important as my sister. But I refused to let it break me, because I knew that if I played my cards right, I would never have to depend on them for anything, and that knowledge kept me going when it felt like I was drowning in exhaustion. While Lillian slept in on weekends, I was already at the diner, refilling coffee cups for truck drivers and exhausted parents, pocketing every tip I earned and tucking it away into my savings. Carol, the owner, was the only person in my life who actually seemed to notice how hard I was working, slipping me extra tips when I looked like I hadn't slept, and making sure I had something to eat before my shifts ended. She was the kind of woman who had seen it all, and she never sugar-coated anything, which is probably why I trusted her more than anyone else in my life at the time. One night, after watching me stress over my college applications during my break, she sat across from me in the empty diner and said, "Baby, you know why some people never make it? Because they're waiting for permission to leave. You don't need permission." That moment stuck with me, echoing in my head every time my mother told me I was being selfish for wanting to go away for school, or every time my father dismissed my ambitions like they were nothing more than a passing phase. The only permission I needed was my own, and I wasn't going to waste any more time hoping they would give me something they had no intention of offering. When my SAT results came in, and I saw that perfect score blinking back at me from the screen, I stared at it for so long that my eyes started to blur, convinced that I had to be reading it wrong. Only a tiny percentage of students ever scored that high. And for a moment, I let myself believe that this would be the thing that finally made my parents see me, that maybe, just maybe, this was big enough to break through the wall of indifference they had built between us. I rushed home, the letter still clutched in my hand, bursting through the door with the kind of excitement I hadn't felt in years, only to be met with the same dismissal I should have expected. My mother barely looked up from the kitchen table, where she was helping Lillian with her English homework, waving me off with a distracted, "That's nice, honey, but can you keep it down? Your sister is trying to concentrate." Before I could even process that, Lillian rolled her eyes and muttered, "Some of us actually have to study, Miss Perfect," as if my accomplishments were nothing more than an inconvenience to her. My mother immediately turned to reassure her, running her hand through Lillian's hair and saying, "Sweetheart, don't stress yourself out. You're just a different kind of learner, that's all." I still have that letter, buried somewhere in a box of things I don't need but can't bring myself to throw away, because no matter how many years pass, I can't quite forget the way that moment felt. I had done something incredible, something that should have been celebrated, and instead, my achievement had been brushed aside like it was nothing, treated as an annoyance rather than a victory. Meanwhile, 2 weeks later, when Lillian managed to scrape by with a C+ in her English class, my parents stuck that report card right on the fridge, proudly displaying it like she had just cured cancer. That was the moment I made the decision that would change everything. I stopped trying to get their approval, stopped hoping for some grand moment of recognition, and started making moves in complete silence. I applied to 15 different universities without telling them, writing all of my own essays, securing my own letters of recommendation, and navigating the financial aid process entirely on my own. Mr. Chun, my guidance counselor, was the only adult who helped me, staying late after school to walk me through the FAFSA forms and making sure I knew which scholarships I had the best shot at winning. When the acceptance letters started rolling in, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Michigan, every single one with full scholarships attached, I didn't tell my parents. I kept them locked away in a box under my bed, knowing exactly what would happen if Lillian found out, because somehow, everything always became about her. The day I received my final acceptance letter, I sat in my usual spot on the 4th floor of the library, staring out at the park below, and for the first time in my life, I let myself cry, not out of sadness, but out of sheer relief. The night I finally told my parents where I was going to college, I expected some kind of reaction, even if it wasn't the one I wanted. Maybe they would try to guilt-trip me into staying close to home, or maybe they would make some dismissive comment about how I thought I was better than everyone else. What I didn't expect was for them to look at me like I had just announced I was moving to another planet, like the idea of me making a decision for myself was so far beyond their understanding that they couldn't even process it. My father set down his fork with a sigh, rubbing his temple as if I had just given him bad news instead of sharing something that should have been a moment of pride, while my mother barely reacted at all, too busy cutting Lillian's chicken into tiny, perfect pieces like she was still 5 years old instead of a fully grown teenager. For a long, excruciating moment, the only sound in the room was the clinking of silverware against plates, the weight of their silence pressing down on me like a stone in my chest. Then my mother sighed, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe I would be so selfish as to inconvenience them with my ambition, her voice tired as she finally spoke. "Michigan is so far, sweetheart. Have you really thought about this? What if Lillian needs you? It's not like we can just drop everything and fly out there if something happens." I had prepared myself for every possible argument they might throw at me, but hearing her say those words, as if my entire existence should revolve around my sister's needs, still managed to send a sharp pulse of anger through me. Before I could even respond, Lillian let out an exaggerated groan, rolling her eyes so hard it was a wonder she didn't strain something, her voice filled with irritation. Oh my God, finally! Can I have your room? I need more space for my TikTok videos, and your walls have better lighting. There wasn't a single hint of hesitation in her voice, not a moment where she considered the possibility that I might feel something about leaving the only home I had ever known, because to her, my absence wasn't a loss. It was an opportunity for more space, more attention, more of everything she had always been given without ever having to earn it. I could feel my father watching me, waiting to see how I would react, but I refused to let them see the way my hands were clenched under the table, my nails pressing so hard into my palms that it almost hurt. I had spent years learning how to swallow my disappointment, how to mask my emotions with indifference so they wouldn't have the satisfaction of knowing how deeply they had failed me, and I wasn't about to break that facade now. Instead of arguing, instead of trying to make them see how much they had let me down, I simply nodded, forcing a neutral expression onto my face as I pushed my chair back from the table. You can do whatever you want with the room, I said, my voice calm in a way that didn't match the storm raging inside me. I won't be coming back. That was the only part of the conversation that seemed to surprise them, because for the first time that night, my mother actually looked up from her plate, her brows furrowing slightly like she had just realized something. Before she could say anything, before Lillian could make another snide remark about how much she was going to love redecorating, I turned and walked out, leaving them to sit in the suffocating silence they had created. I didn't stop moving until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my skin like a slap, my breath coming faster than I wanted it to. I had always known, deep down, that I meant nothing to them compared to Lillian, but hearing it so plainly, so casually, was something else entirely. I had spent years hoping that, at the very least, my leaving would make them realize what they had done, that maybe once I was gone, they would finally see how little they had given me. But they wouldn't, because in their minds, nothing had ever been wrong. Lillian was the priority, and I had simply been the extra, the one who had taken care of herself so efficiently that they had never needed to worry about me. They would never look back and wonder why I had left, because to them, my absence wouldn't be a loss. It would be a convenience, one less thing to consider in their carefully curated world of Lillian's endless wants and needs. The only person who showed up for me on move-in day was Aunt Valerie, who drove me the entire way to campus and spent hours helping me set up my dorm, making sure I had everything I needed before she finally handed me an envelope stuffed with cash. Your grandma wanted you to have this, she said, pressing it into my hands before I could argue. She's so proud of you. I didn't open it until later that night, after she had hugged me one last time and driven away, leaving me alone in a room that already felt more like home than the house I had spent my entire life in. Inside the envelope was $500, all in small, neatly folded bills, and when I realized what that meant, that my grandmother had been setting aside whatever little she could just to help me get started, something inside me cracked open. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the money for a long time, my hands shaking slightly as I thought about everything I had left behind, about how little my own parents had done for me compared to the woman who had been pushed aside just as much as I had. That first night, I made a promise to myself, one that would shape every decision I made from that point forward. I wasn't going to succeed out of spite, wasn't going to let my life be driven by the need to prove them wrong, because they would never acknowledge that they had been wrong in the first place. I was going to succeed for the little girl who had been sent away every time she sneezed, for the teenager who had eaten alone while her family celebrated mediocrity, for the woman who was finally free. College was a blur of sleepless nights, endless exams, and a level of freedom I had never known before, and for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who actually saw me. I graduated at the top of my class, not that my parents noticed, because they were too busy dealing with the fact that Lillian had already transferred schools twice, burning through tuition money like it was nothing. By the time I landed my first job at a high-end auction house, I had long since stopped expecting them to care, but that didn't mean their disinterest hurt any less. I threw myself into my work, using the skills I had learned from organizing my grandmother's old jewelry collection to build a name for myself in an industry that had no patience for mistakes. I worked harder than anyone, stayed later than everyone, and learned everything there was to know about authentication, knowing that if I wanted to survive in this world, I had to be better than anyone else. The turning point came when I identified an Art Deco brooch that everyone else had written off as costume jewelry. Something about the weight and the clasp feeling just slightly off. I spent 2 weeks researching every possible detail, using the company's database to cross-reference signatures and historical records, until I found the proof I needed. When it sold for $42,000, my boss finally looked at me like I was worth something. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. After that first successful authentication, something shifted in the way people at the auction house looked at me, like they had suddenly realized I was more than just another disposable employee cataloging furniture and overpriced porcelain figurines. My boss, who had barely remembered my name a month earlier, started sending more difficult cases my way, testing me to see if my first big find had been a fluke or if I actually had the kind of talent that could make the company real money. I knew better than to waste the opportunity, so I threw myself into the work, staying long after everyone else had gone home to study authentication guides, cross-reference hallmarks, and build my own database of reference materials that most employees wouldn't have bothered with. The more I learned, the more obsessed I became with the intricacies of antique jewelry, the small details that separated a worthless imitation from a lost treasure, the tiny imperfections that revealed the truth hidden beneath decades of dust and neglect. Most of the other employees didn't care about authentication, content to let the senior specialists handle anything that required actual expertise, but I lived for the challenge, for the moment when a seemingly insignificant piece turned out to be something extraordinary. I started getting a reputation within the industry, first as the obsessive junior specialist who spent too much time researching, then as the woman who had an uncanny ability to spot pieces that everyone else had overlooked. The moment that changed everything came 2 years into the job, when I was assigned to catalog the estate of an old money family whose name carried weight in circles far above my own. The collection was massive, filled with pieces that had been passed down through generations, and most of it had already been identified and valued before I even set foot in the house. My job was supposed to be routine, log the items, confirm the appraisals, and make sure nothing had been misplaced or incorrectly labeled before the final sale. But as I worked through the endless trays of jewelry, my fingers brushing over gold and platinum that had been touched by people long dead, I felt a strange pull toward a piece that everyone else had dismissed as unremarkable. It was an Art Nouveau brooch, delicate and understated, the kind of thing that most buyers wouldn't look at twice, but something about it felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The craftsmanship was too precise for an imitation, the class too intricate for a mass-produced piece, and the weight in my palm didn't match the materials listed in the initial appraisal. I spent 3 nights researching, barely sleeping, cross-referencing design elements with historical records, and comparing it to known works from the same era, chasing the nagging feeling that I was missing something important. When I finally found the proof I needed, buried in an obscure European archive that documented lost pieces from the early 20th century, I realized I was holding something far more valuable than anyone had anticipated. The brooch wasn't just an old family heirloom. It was part of a private collection created by a famous French jeweler, believed to have been lost during World War II, making it one of the only surviving pieces of its kind. By the time the auction was over, the brooch had sold for $238,000, and my boss called me into his office with a look I had never seen on his face before. I had been expecting a raise, maybe even a promotion, but instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment before saying something that would change the course of my life. "You're wasting your talent here," he said, his voice calm but certain. "You should be running your own authentication business." I laughed at first, thinking he was joking, because the idea of starting my own company seemed ridiculous when I could barely afford my rent, but the thought took root in my mind and refused to let go. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that he was right, that I was never going to reach my full potential working for someone else, always waiting for permission to take on bigger projects, always limited by what my superiors thought I was capable of. So I did the only thing that made sense. I took out a loan that made my stomach twist with anxiety, emptied my savings account, and rented the cheapest office space I could find in a part of town where no one would ask too many questions. The office was a glorified storage room above a Chinese restaurant, the kind of place where the walls smelled like Kung Pao chicken no matter how many air fresheners I used, and the Wi-Fi only worked if I sat in the corner by the window. For the first 6 months, I woke up every morning in a cold sweat, running calculations in my head to figure out how long I had before I ran out of money and had to crawl back to the auction house with my pride in shreds. My office furniture consisted of a folding table from a thrift store and a chair I had literally found on the curb and scrubbed clean, and there were nights when I stayed so late researching that I ended up sleeping under my desk because I couldn't justify wasting gas driving home. But I had something that no one else in my industry seemed to care about: an obsessive attention to detail and a willingness to outwork everyone else. I started small, offering authentication services to antique dealers who couldn't afford the bigger firms, building a reputation for accuracy and discretion that spread faster than I expected. The turning point came when a dealer I had worked with at the auction house called me about a collection of Victorian brooches, asking if I could authenticate them before they went to market. The collection turned out to be far more significant than anyone had realized, containing 2 rare pieces that had been misidentified as later reproductions, and the owner was so impressed with my detailed report that she not only paid my fee, but also gave me a 10% commission when the pieces sold. That commission check was $86,000, more money than I had made in the previous 2 years combined, and suddenly, everything shifted. My phone started ringing more often, private collectors began reaching out directly, estate lawyers wanted consultations on inheritance disputes, and even my old auction house started sending me cases they didn't have the bandwidth to handle. By the end of my 2nd year in business, I had hired my first employee, a gemology graduate who reminded me too much of myself at that age: smart, hardworking, and overlooked by people who couldn't see past her quiet demeanor. Within 5 years, I had offices in 3 cities, a client list that included some of the wealthiest collectors in the world, and a personal net worth that had climbed past $12 million, though I kept my lifestyle deliberately modest. I didn't care about flashy cars or designer clothes, preferring to invest in my business, but the one place I allowed myself to splurge was my home office. I had a custom-built vault with security that rivaled Fort Knox, state-of-the-art authentication equipment, and a private collection of vintage pieces that I had no intention of ever selling. The irony of it all was that my parents still thought I worked at some small antique shop, casually mentioning to their friends that I played with old jewelry, while assuming I was barely scraping by. They had no idea that I was being quoted in Forbes, that I was consulting for international collectors, or that my company had cornered the market on high-end authentication in the Midwest. For years, I let them believe whatever they wanted, never bothering to correct their assumptions. But the truth was, keeping the secret had become more entertaining than anything else. I wore jewelry worth more than their mortgage to family dinners, waiting to see if anyone would notice, knowing they never would, because in their eyes, I would always be the invisible daughter, the one who never needed anything, the one they had never really seen. The thing about secrets is that no matter how carefully you keep them, no matter how much effort you put into maintaining control, there will always be a moment when they slip through the cracks. I had spent years keeping my life separate from my family, maintaining the illusion that I was still just the forgettable older sister who worked at a little antique shop, someone too unimportant to be noticed. But I had underestimated one thing: Lillian's insatiable need to turn everything into a spectacle. It wasn't enough for her to be the center of attention in her own life. She had to make sure that every moment was about her, even when it had nothing to do with her at all. Thanksgiving had never been my favorite holiday, mostly because it required me to sit through hours of Lillian talking about her latest expensive purchases while my mother tried to convince everyone that her dry turkey wasn't the worst thing they had ever eaten. But that year, things were different. Because my mother had thrown out her back a few weeks earlier and had started hinting, rather dramatically, that cooking an entire meal for 20 people might be too much for her fragile state. I could have ignored it, could have let her struggle through the holiday like she always did. But part of me was tired of pretending, tired of forcing myself to choke down terrible food and sit through another meal where I was treated like an afterthought. So I did something I had never done before. I volunteered to handle the meal, offering to have the entire thing catered from a high-end service I used for my business events, the kind of place that only the wealthiest clients could afford. My mother hesitated at first, probably because the idea of me taking over something that had always been her responsibility made her uncomfortable. But the moment she realized it meant she wouldn't have to do any actual work, she accepted without a second thought. She made a show of sighing dramatically, placing a hand on her lower back like she was carrying the weight of the world, before saying, "I suppose we don't have any other choice. I just hope it's not too expensive, sweetheart. We can't afford anything fancy." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing, because the cost of the catering was more than what they probably made in 2 months. But I just smiled and told her not to worry about it, letting her assume I had been saving up for it like some struggling martyr. The food arrived exactly on time, perfectly arranged and smelling like something out of a five-star restaurant. And for the first time in years, I actually enjoyed watching my family eat. My mother kept apologizing to everyone, insisting that it wasn't homemade, but it was clear that no one cared, not when they were too busy enjoying food that wasn't overcooked and underseasoned. Lillian, of course, had to find something to complain about, poking at her plate with a frown before muttering, "Store-bought stuffing? Really, Sarah? Mom's is so much better." This coming from the same person who once set off the smoke alarm trying to make toast, the same person who thought boiling water was a complicated task. I ignored her, choosing to focus on the fact that, for the first time in my life, I had managed to contribute something to this family gathering that wasn't completely dismissed. But, as always, Lillian couldn't stand to let me have a single moment where I wasn't the target of her passive-aggressive nonsense. At some point between dinner and dessert, I had stepped away to check my laptop, monitoring an important online auction that was taking place in Hong Kong. One of my clients had been bidding on an incredibly rare Art Nouveau necklace, and if they won, I needed to be ready to authenticate it immediately. I had left my authentication software open, multiple tabs displaying account balances, pending contracts, and profit reports, but I hadn't thought twice about it, because no one in my family had ever cared enough to pay attention to what I was doing. Unfortunately, Lillian had never been able to resist the opportunity to humiliate me, and when she barged into my old bedroom to borrow a charger, her eyes landed on my laptop screen. For a brief moment, she just stood there, staring at the numbers in front of her, her brain struggling to process what she was seeing. Then, in the way only Lillian could, she grabbed my laptop without hesitation, marching back into the dining room like she had just uncovered the biggest scandal of the century. I barely had time to react before she spun the screen around for everyone to see, her voice dripping with satisfaction as she said, "Time to see what kind of important work Sarah's been up to on Thanksgiving." Silence. That was the first thing I noticed. The way the entire room seemed to freeze the moment my account balances and financial reports came into view. The numbers spoke for themselves: 12.4 million in liquid assets, a pending contract worth nearly $500,000, a quarterly profit report that showed more revenue than my parents had probably earned in their entire lives. Lillian's smug expression faltered as she realized no one was laughing. No one was rolling their eyes at my so-called pathetic career, because for the first time, they were seeing the truth they had ignored for years. The color drained from my mother's face as she let out a shaky laugh, shaking her head in disbelief before saying, "Don't be silly, sweetheart. Sarah works at that little antique shop." I closed my laptop slowly, standing up as I met her eyes, my voice calm but firm as I said, "Actually, Mom, I own one of the largest jewelry authentication companies in the country. Have for years. Those antique shop comments? I authenticate pieces worth millions. That little business you never asked about has offices in 3 cities." My father choked on his wine, my aunt dropped her fork, and even my uncle, who had never paid attention to anything in his life, let out a stunned cough. But it was my mother's face that held my attention, the way her laughter twisted into something else, something darker, something furious. She stood so fast that her chair tipped over behind her, her voice rising into a near scream as she demanded, "You have millions, and you let us struggle?" Struggle. That was the word that broke something inside me, that sent years of buried resentment rising to the surface like a flood I could no longer hold back. I had been sending them $7,000 every single month, had been quietly paying down their mortgage while they spent money on Lillian's endless indulgences, had been making sure they never truly faced financial hardship, and yet they had the audacity to act as if I had abandoned them. Before I could even respond, Lillian's voice cut through the chaos, shaking with fury as she demanded, "How could you keep this from us? I'm your sister. I deserve to know." I stared at her, at the girl who had taken everything from me my entire life and still had the nerve to think she was owed more, and for the first time in years, I felt absolutely nothing for her. No anger, no sadness, no desire to make her understand. Just the cold, undeniable truth that I didn't owe her, or any of them, a damn thing. I picked up my laptop, grabbed my coat, and without another word, I walked out the door, leaving them to sit in the wreckage of the reality they had refused to see.